There have been many interesting poker stories since the past decades, but none of them comes close to the one involving a single businessman and a select group of the world's greatest ever poker players who sat down and played 50, 100,000 stakes in what was known as the greatest cash game in poker history. This is the legendary story of the corporation versus Andy Beal and inside the richest cash game that ever took place. The corporation was a group of professional poker players led by the godfather of poker himself, Doyle Brunson. The story of how they came together and formed a $10 million syndicate to defeat a billionaire banker is one of the greatest tales of poker lore ever recorded. This story is about more than dollar amounts. The willingness of the world's best poker players to risk everything was both impressive and alarming at the same time. Their adversary was Andy Beal, a Texas-based businessman who had never played poker seriously before March 2001. He was the founder and chairman of Beal Bank and Beal Aerospace Technologies and listed by Forbes magazine as one of the wealthiest men in the United States. Our story begins in February of 2001. While on a visit to Las Vegas, Andy Beal dropped by the poker room at the Bellagio to play a bit of limit hold'em. When he got on a winning streak, the banker upped his game first to 8160 table and then to one with stakes of $400, $800. That's when Doyle Brunson's son, professional poker player Todd Brunson, took notice of the high roller and invited him to play a heads-up game. Shockingly, the Texan's luck held true and he defeated the young pro rather easily. Word of the upset quickly spread through the high-stakes section of the poker floor known as Bobby's Room. Andy Beal had his bank wire more money to the Bellagio and he played at Table 1 over the next 2 days. The regular game at Table 1 was usually 1,000-2,000 mixed game where the players starting the game choose various forms of poker to play in 10-hand rotations. When Andy arrived, he and 3 other pros started playing 1,000-2,000 limit hold'em. By the second day, Andy Beal was facing a lineup of the best big money poker players in the world. Doyle Brunson, Chip Reese, John Hennigan, Jennifer Harman, Xiao Jiang, and Todd Brunson. If Andy Beal at that time was intimidated by the quality of the opposition, he did not show it. In fact, he insisted on raising the stakes from 1,000, 2,000 to 2,000, 4,000 and finally to 4,000, 8,000 by the end of the second day, making it the highest stakes game since the Bellagio opened in 1998. As the game filled up, it became less fun for Andy and he kept raising the stakes to maintain his interest as well as to test the professionals. He was aware that high blinds have a consequence. Some pros start to get uncomfortable playing that high and vary their game to save themselves a few bets here and there, and before the day was done, Andy Beal had taken the pros for more than $100,000. But Andy realized he had a much better time playing heads up against Todd than at the long table, even though the blinds were 5 times higher. Back in Dallas, Andy asked his secretary to buy him the 15 most popular books on poker and gobbles them up. However, he's not too impressed with what he reads. He agrees on the importance of pot odds, but they did not give enough attention to the statistics. He knew mathematical tables weren't for everyone, but the key to the game was understanding the probabilities. Without knowing them, all the strategies advocated by the authors would be less effective. The basic strategy advocated in these books was too conservative. Andy wanted to play again, but he also wondered if the pros allowed him to win so that they can bait him and kept him hooked to the game. $100,000 sure sounded like a lot of money to keep Andy interested. Next month, Andy Beal returns to the Bellagio. Despite his victory on his last visit, the pros weren't too impressed with his game. The room fills up and more players keep showing up. Andy again gets bored of playing at the long table, and on a break in the game, he approaches Jennifer Harman and offers her to play heads up at a separate table. Andy did not realize that he was putting Jennifer in a very uncomfortable situation. Jennifer does not know how to tell that what he asks cannot be done. First of all, the other poker players will get mad at her if she plays with Andy herself, and it doesn't matter which table she sits at because sooner or later it will fill up. Andy was not aware that he was still considered a whale, so no matter how much he raised the stakes, the table will always fill up because many people have come to Las Vegas just to play with the maniacal billionaire who was learning to play poker. Andy then decides to take the initiative and speak with the management of the Bellagio to organize a heads-up game for him, but all he gets is the information that there are no specific tables at the Bellagio for heads-up poker. All tables are long, and management cannot prevent anyone from sitting at the tables as long as they have the minimum buy-in. Andy Beal does not understand that the Bellagio is indifferent if they play for blinds of 2,000 or 200,000. They take the same commission in both cases. This was one of the greatest enemies of poker in Las Vegas casinos. The rake that poker leaves at the house is ridiculous compared to the benefits of slots, roulette, or baccarat. Even Steve Wynn, one who signed WSOP champion Bobby Baldwin to his management team and hence the name Bobby's Room, was about to close the poker room when he found out that one of his greatest whales, George the Greek, was dividing his time between the baccarat and poker tables. It took all the influence of his team not to shut it down or bar Chip Reese or Doyle Brunson from entering. Andy even offered to pay for the empty seats, but he is not allowed to do so. The billionaire was very frustrated and threatened to go back to Dallas if he cannot play heads up. If Andy left the Bellagio, it would be bad for poker in general. Anxious to get their money back, the pros would start looking for him to convince him to play in their private games. Beal was too clever to fall into any traps. He knew that they could easily gang up on him and collude to see he would lose. The best thing for everyone is that these games take place in a controlled environment like the Bellagio. Even though many of the top players were multimillionaires, none of them could afford to take Beal on without risking his entire bankroll, and they certainly didn't want to do that. Neither did they want to miss out on a potential sucker. So Doyle Brunson came up with a solution. He said he would arrange for several players to combine their bankroll, and one of them would play everyone's money against him with blinds so high that no other player could afford to sit in the game. At first, Andy was not too amused by the idea as he lost the advantage of pushing the pros out of their comfort zone with the big blinds, but after all, it was the only way to have his heads-up game. Doyle contacted and received the go-ahead from all high-stakes regulars: Chip Reese, Jennifer Harman, Howard Lederer, John Hennigan, Xiao Jiang, and David Gray. Together, they would put up $1 million to play against the billionaire. Negotiations between Doyle and Andy continued in more detail. Andy wanted to choose who he would play with, which was granted to him as long as he accepted the first player was Chip Reese because the match would be the next day and there was only so much time to make sure the player was available. In return, Doyle Brunson managed to keep the blinds at 10,000, 20,000. The game was finally ready for the next day, but before leaving, Doyle reminded Andy that although they had done everything in their power, there was always the unlikely possibility that someone wanted to sit at the table and they could do nothing about it. And that is exactly what happened on game day. But who could appear out of nowhere and sit in a game where both players would bring $1 million to the table? Finally, it was game day on Wednesday, March 7th, 2001. Regulation 23 of the Nevada Gaming Commission and the State Gaming Control Board required the rules of each game to be posted at the table. This meant the Bellagio always had a plastic card to the dealer's left stating the game, the stakes, the blinds, or the antes, and the rake. There had never been a poker game this big, so the Bellagio did not have a placard with the game information. Someone taped a piece of paper over another placard writing 10,000, 20,000, Texas Hold'em, minimum buy-in 100,000, and blinds of 5,000, 10,000. Ted Forrest walked in the Bellagio that day, and he was one of those rare players who was willing to bet everything on the right situation. Doyle never reached Ted because he was in California at the time. Unaware of the negotiations or the financial arrangements between the players, Ted sat down in seat 6 just after 1 p.m. simply because it seemed like a good game, a money-making opportunity. Almost instantly, he regretted the decision. The $500,000 he brought to the table was his entire bankroll, and he lost 80% of it in 20 minutes. And did not even get much action for his $400,000. However, he remained calm and got into the rhythm of the game, won a few big pots, and was soon even. Ted Forrest then went on a heater against Andy Beal, and by dinner time, he was out of money. Without talking to Chip Reese or the stunned onlookers at table 1, Ted Forrest left the table with more than a profit of $1 million. The corporation was however sick that Ted walked away with all the money they were supposed to win. So to prevent the situation from ever happening again, Doyle Brunson asked Ted to join the group, and Ted agreed on the condition that he would get to play Andy heads up the next day. Andy Beal and Ted Forrest met the next afternoon for a rematch, this time heads up. Andy came out firing chips, even more aggressive than the day before, but Ted had sized up his opponent from the previous day and kept Andy on a leash. Andy also continued to agitate to raise the stakes, this time to $20,000, $40,000. Ted obliged and won $2 million for the group. The next to play Andy was Jennifer Harman. Jennifer was in control from the start, but every time she had the match nearly closed out, Andy Beal would get the lucky card he needed to win a big pot and keep the game alive. Finally, after 10 hours, Jennifer had 20 stacks of $5,000 chips and Andy had only green felt in front of him. The last player Andy Beal faced in the series of matches was the Professor Howard Lederer. Howard made short work of Andy, winning $1 million in less than 3 hours. Howard Lederer played heads-up hold'em even more aggressively than Andy, and the banker found himself increasingly checking and calling when Howard came charging at him. Doyle Brunson had called Lederer the best limit hold'em player in the world a few years earlier, and he demonstrated why. If it wasn't clear to Andy Beal before, it was clear by now. He was far behind the poker professionals in every area that counted for his game. He knew that challenging the best players in the world would end in failure. Besides, he wanted to test himself and he needed to find out how poker worked. As much respect as Beal had for the pros, he thought their biggest weakness was the fundamental soundness of their games. In the simple math of making plays based on the proper odds, he felt they were not experts. This was understandable. First, their instincts were honed from tens of thousands of hours at the table. They did not need to work out the math. Secondly, their ability to read their opponent was so advanced that it provided a better basis for a decision than pot odds, which became increasingly subjective when it came to evaluating the probabilities based on the opponent's cards. Andy would never be able to match them for experience and instinct. On the other hand, he felt he could match and maybe exceed their ability to work out the right play based on the odds with the brute force of his intellect and determination. Andy wrote his own poker program in BASIC. It was very simple, dealing a combination of 52 cards in the deck and running large number of trials to determine the likelihood of different hands prevailing. In addition, he could set up situations and run them a million times to see the likelihood of different results. Andy Beal spent hours after hours at his desk whenever he had some time, running his poker program and trying out different combinations and different developments on the board. He knew he would never have the pros faculty for reading opponents, but he would pit himself against any one of them for knowing the percentages. Andy Beal finally returned to the Bellagio on Tuesday, December 11, 2001, nearly 9 months after his last visit to the poker room. From Wednesday through Saturday, Andy Beal systematically mowed down the best players in the world, racking up decisive wins over Todd Brunson, Jennifer Harman, John Hennigan, Ted Forrest, Xiao Jiang, and others, winning several $1 million from them. Every time Andy Beal cleaned out one of the pros, the team had to reconstitute its bankroll. It was a time-consuming and demoralizing experience. The whole room was feeling the pain. The pros were completely unprepared for Andy to beat them and for him to do it day after day. They knew an inexperienced opponent could, theoretically, get lucky and win, but they didn't expect that he would do so repeatedly. After 4 days of intense battling at the poker table, Beal had cleaned out the pros for more than $5.3 million. The next day, however, the corporation managed to scramble $1.5 million to take one last shot at Andy Beal. It was decided that Howard Lederer was going to play him heads up, but Ted Forrest arrived before him and started the match. Andy had been pressurizing his opponents to double the stakes to $20,000, $40,000, so that's what they did. Ted Forrest had a plan, this time for Andy. The usual strategy for heads up, especially among the pros, was to play as aggressive as possible, but Beal wasn't backing down on this trip. That meant they were playing showdown for a couple of $100,000 per hand. So Ted Forrest stood the traditional strategy on its head. He would play more passively, though only by a degree. The idea would be to let Andy win more pots, but use his superior skill and experience to get away from weaker hands and win most of the big pots. The strategy immediately began paying off, and by the end of the session, Ted Forrest had won back $3.4 million of the group's money, and later, Howard Lederer finished him off and the corporation recouped their entire loss. For Beal, the loss stung more than the amount involved. He had lost much more than that in his business. This felt personal for Andy. Andy Beal told Chip Reese that he was through with poker, and he meant it. At least, he thought he did. On the contrary, Andy Beal got his money's worth. To be able to play and defeat in succession Jennifer Harman, Todd Brunson, John Hennigan, Ted Forrest, Xiao Jiang, and Doyle Brunson would be the experience of a lifetime for any person who played poker. It almost took a year, but Andy Beal's brain would not allow him to let go of poker completely. Involuntarily, almost, his mind focused on trying to figure it out. He started to analyze why they had beaten him and was again hooked to poker. A year later, and nearly after 6 months of preparation, Andy Beal thought he was ready. Beal was back in Vegas on April of 2003. On Monday, April 28th, Andy Beal had wired money to the Bellagio and asked the poker room to contact Doyle Brunson. They spent most of Monday negotiating over the stakes. Andy wanted to play as high as possible to take the pros out of their comfort zone. Brunson explained that the players were busy with the World Series of Poker and their regular games and suggested they play $20,000, $40,000 instead. Andy wanted to play $50,000, $100,000. By the end of the day, both parties agreed to play $30,000, $60,000. There was no problem in raising enough money for a $30,000, $60,000 game. Despite the close call at the end of 2001, investing in the top pros against Andy Beal was still a good investment. Beal first played Barry Greenstein and then Chip Reese. Andy won from Chip Reese, not a huge amount, but enough to get him feeling comfortable playing again with the top pros. Later that day, Andy played Howard Lederer, his chief nemesis, back in 2001. Playing Andy at $30,000, $60,000, Howard Lederer lost $1.8 million. He ended the first day ahead by over $2 million. The next day was the same story. Ted Forrest agreed with Barry Greenstein that Andy was outplaying them. Andy had made himself hard to read and was doing a good job at noticing when they changed speeds. He was also dangerous with his aggressive style, but if he could keep such tight control of himself and remain methodical, he had an excellent chance of winning. It was an impressive return after a 16-month absence. Upon Doyle's request, Jennifer Harman played Andy next, and it was a very impressive performance. In 3 days, she destroyed Andy, winning almost $9 million. Other players won along the way, but it was Jennifer's consistent winning that sent Andy Beal back to Dallas, a loser once again. Once again, he would only question why he stayed so long, why he played so many hours, and why playing this silly game had taken on so much importance in his life. Jennifer Harman's success allowed them to ignore that Andy Beal was becoming a very talented heads-up hold'em player. He had improved and adapted. Ted Forrest was a net loser on the trip, and Howard Lederer only came out a bit ahead. Would Andy Beal return to Vegas to take his revenge? When Andy Beal came to Las Vegas in spring, he did not let the pros know he was coming until he was already at the Bellagio. He did this to keep the pros from practicing something they wouldn't have done anyway. But Todd Brunson did practice. He and Ted Forrest got together one day and played 2 freeze-outs with play chips, each taking a turn playing as Beal would. After Jennifer Harman, Todd Brunson was the big winner against Andy in the spring. Andy Beal had been working on his own game throughout the summer. He was sure he was onto something, but executing it proved more difficult than he expected. During his last 2 trips, he had started out winning. His aggressive style and understanding of the fundamentals made him competitive. He felt his problem was that he was letting the pros get to him. With nothing else to do but play and no set times to finish or go home, he was staying for too many days, playing too long, and losing his focus. Once he became fatigued, he was easier to read. He knew he was becoming careless in many little ways, holding his cards differently, moving his body and head differently, ignoring his signals to slow down and randomize some decisions. Andy won some and lost some in this trip, but his main motive was to convince the group to somehow play him for $50,000, $100,000 stakes. Beal and Brunson were both in negotiation mode. If Andy Beal wired $10 million to the Bellagio, they would give him his game. Andy wanted to limit the group's ability to substitute players. Doyle told him at those stakes he could use anybody he wanted whenever he wanted. The way they left it, the group would be limited to 2 players a day, they would play at least 6 to 8 hours, and Andy could stop whenever he wanted for the day. Andy Beal was happy that he finally got his wish to play ultra high stakes for $10 million until one of the parties had the entire $20 million. The next day, Jennifer and Andy Beal played the highest stake poker game in history from 7 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. Andy won more than $3 million from Jennifer. It was not a giant win, but he had prevailed against one of the best limit hold'em players in the world. He had again demonstrated that he had the game to compete at the highest level if he played his best. Todd Brunson was next to fall to Andy. Beal was ahead by $5 million for day 1. Next day, however, was a different story. Todd Brunson wore Andy Beal down, then maximized his return on Beal's mistakes. He continued letting Andy be the aggressor, but when Andy Beal overextended himself, the young pro trapped him and won a big pot. With his opponent playing less carefully, Todd was able to use the momentum on future hands. Having just gotten trapped for a bunch of chips, it was more difficult for Andy to play aggressive in the face of Todd's increased aggression. For the last couple of $1 million, Andy felt he just gave his money away. It was as if he could play only perfectly or terribly. Once his game slipped, he felt completely exposed. Andy Beal had adopted the professional's indifference to money and it came back to haunt him. According to Todd Brunson, he won the group more than $13 million over 2 days. Andy Beal was disgusted with himself. He had done the very thing he knew led to his defeat in the spring, allowed himself to be worn down by playing too much, then playing badly in that condition. He didn't know whether he wanted to get away from poker forever or try again, but without making such a stupid error. Andy was once again back to Vegas on May 10th, 2004 and wished to play as high as $100,000, $200,000. Andy Beal's arrival recreated the stress and chaos of his previous visits. The group settled on playing 50-100. The composition of the team had changed since last year. Most of the players, except for Ted Forrest from the original group, were still in. A number of new players joined as they became part of the corporation, including Lee Salem, Gus Hansen, and Phil Ivey. There were at least 15 members in the group at this time, and several members had sold pieces to other players. Andy Beal won $1.3 million from Xiaojiang, however, lost back $6.3 million to Howard Lederer, putting the group ahead by $5 million. Andy wasn't panicking either. He felt good about his game, but had to conclude that maybe Howard had his number. Andy had struggled against other members of the corporation at various times, Ted Forrest in 2001, Jennifer in 2003, Todd Brunson during 2003 both trips, but he felt Howard Lederer matched up against him differently. For example, he was awed by Todd's gift of discovering and exploiting his weaknesses and lapses in play, but he could combat that by shoring up those weaknesses. Even if Todd continued to beat him, he felt there was always something he could do to improve. But against Howard Lederer, Andy Beal had no idea. If Andy did not have to play Howard Lederer again, he thought he could win. Because he was down $5 million, he needed to wire more money to the Bellagio. He used the break in the game to negotiate with Doyle Brunson and other players in the group on Thursday afternoon and evening. Beal wanted to play the big game, $100,000, $200,000. He renewed his threat to leave if he didn't get his way. With Lederer's win, the pros had a taste of Andy's money and were hungry for more. The members of the group negotiating with Beal agreed to let him have his way. They would play $100,000, $200,000. Over the course of the evening, they agreed to the following additional conditions. Andy would have to play 2 days at these stakes, at least 5 hours each day. Number 2, each side would bring at least $10 million to the table. Number 3, the pros could use only one player per day. And lastly, Beal would not have to play Howard Lederer at these stakes. Andy Beal got everything he wanted. He considered having Howard Lederer out of the match to be important, but even Beal didn't realize how significant a concession that would be. On Wednesday, May 12, 2004 at 3:30 p.m., Andy Beal and Todd Brunson began the richest poker game of all time. Brunson started on top. After 30 minutes, he was ahead by $3 to $4 million. In a lose heads-up game where nearly every hand was raised before the flop, just one bet after the flop meant at least $500,000 would be riding on the hand. They also played a lot of hands. Table 1 had an automatic shuffler, but the dealer would manually shuffle the deck if a hand had concluded and the machines were still shuffling. Over the next hour, Andy took control, erasing the deficit and winning several $million. But by nightfall, Todd raised the deficit and took a small lead. At 9:45 p.m., Andy decided to call it a day. Andy was getting tired and he did not want to make the mistake he had made in the past of playing too long. Despite having over $6 million of Andy Beal's money, the pros were in trouble, more serious trouble than they dared admit. Who would play Andy on the second day? Howard Lederer was banned, Todd Brunson was exhausted, Harman was too sick, and Ted Forrest did not make the team this time. Phil Ivey wouldn't play Andy Beal at these stakes. It was finally decided that Chip Reese would play him. They started day 2 of the biggest game of all time at table 1 just after 7 o'clock in the morning. Although Chip Reese thought he had beaten Beal in most of their previous games, other members of the team remember it indifferently, as did Beal himself. In any event, Andy Beal was not intimidated by the prospect of facing Chip Reese, despite Reese's well-deserved reputation as one of the greatest poker players of all time. Beal started ahead and stayed ahead. By 11:40 a.m., the session was over and they broke for lunch. Andy Beal had won $8 million from Chip Reese. For the trip, he was ahead only by $2 million, but he had nearly cleaned out the supply of chips the pros had brought to the table less than 5 hours earlier. Being the biggest game in history, it was, not surprisingly, the biggest winning session in history, and he did it against one of the best poker players who ever lived. The players debated who would play Beal, who told them he would be back at 2 p.m. He made it clear that this would be his last day in Vegas, though he did not say how late he would play. Hamid Desmalchi played Beal from 2 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. For the first hour, he won back $5 million, more than half the money lost by Chip in the morning session, but Beal regained control of the match. By 4:30 p.m., Andy had retaken the $5 million from Hamid. Doyle Brunson knew they needed to make a change, and Gus Hansen was next to play, feeling confident. Gus Hansen, like his predecessor, immediately took the lead on his amateur opponent, quickly winning $2 million. Hansen's aggressive style, however, was not a good match against Beal. Gus was learning, like Ted Forrest, Howard Lederer, Jennifer Harman, and Todd Brunson before him, that you could not bluff Andy, and countering his aggression with more aggression turned the match into a showdown where the experienced pros traded skill for large pots, going to the player with the better cards. By 6 p.m., Gus Hansen had lost a $2 million back to Beal and bluffed off another $2 million as well. Hansen got up from the seat. He reached his limit and wasn't going to play him anymore. Jennifer Harman was next to play Andy. Andy, with some clever play, managed to beat Jennifer. He erased the $5 million deficit and then won another $1.5 million before finally turning over his chips to security. He quickly counted the chips before signing the forms from the supervisor. For that day, Andy Beal had won $11.7 million. For the 2-day, $100,000-$200,000 game, he was quitting ahead by over $10.6 million. Even subtracting his losses at $5,100,000, he had nearly $6 million for 4 days. The trip was a disaster for the high-stakes pros. Their losses came to over $300,000 per person. Their wins over Beal during the previous 3 years far exceeded that, but that money was long gone. In addition, several new members of the team never experienced those victories. It was a very bad night to be a professional player in Las Vegas. However, Jennifer Harman was correct about one thing: Andy Beal could not stay away. Feeling cocky and in retrospect a little stupid, he returned to Bellagio on Monday, May 24th, less than 2 weeks later, to take a shot at the pros and to let the pros take a shot at him. When Beal arrived to negotiate over the stakes, he naturally met with resistance. The pros were adamant this time. They would have to concede that he won at the highest stakes of all time. They were afraid to play as high as he wanted. The players fell into dissension for the reason for the loss. The first mistake was that they allowed Beal to reach the goal of raising the stakes high enough to make the pros sweat. The magic number to do that was $100,000, $200,000. For Jennifer Harman, the pressure of the stakes became magnified by the decision to let Andy Beal exclude Howard Lederer from the match. Phil Ivey played Andy Beal on Monday and Tuesday at limits of $30,000, $60,000. Perhaps spurred on by the implication that had ducked Beal during his early May win, Ivey wanted the first chance he could get to play the banker. Phil Ivey was ultra competitive and had established himself over the previous years as a successful player at the highest stakes imaginable, but did not intimidate Andy Beal at all. After 2 days of play, Phil Ivey had essentially broken even. Andy Beal knew he would have problems against Todd Brunson and Howard Lederer. Todd Brunson was superb at reading him and capitalizing on his mistakes. Lederer was impossible to figure out. Andy Beal came to town ready to insist that he would not play either of them. As with limiting the stakes, the players had made it clear that they would rather pass up the chance to win his money than give in to his demands. He got hammered by the group's two toughest players on May 26th and 27th. On Wednesday, at $30,000, $60,000, Todd Brunson won $5 million in 6 hours. Andy Beal stuck with his earlier announced decision to stop after that amount of play. Ahead by $5 million, the players let Beal raise the stakes to $50,000, $100,000 for this match against Howard Lederer on Thursday. It was a concession that proved expensive, but this time for Andy Beal. They played for nearly 8 hours and Lederer felt completely in command. He won another $9.3 million from Andy Beal. As Andy Beal left the poker room on May 27th, he knew that his two toughest opponents had played their best game and claimed significant victories. But increasingly, his mind was occupied with a question he could not answer. Where was Andy going with this? Poker was gradually taking over his mind, if not his life. He was spending a lot of time working on his poker game, something he recognized was necessary to have any chance against the pros. Even when he was doing something else, like taking his daughters for a walk or working on a $50 million business deal, his thoughts would wander to poker. Although Andy was supposed to play Phil Ivey again the next morning, he returned to the Bellagio poker room a few minutes later and found Howard Lederer and David Gray still counting and racking chips and following the procedures for returning them to the cage and to the team's bankroll. He reached out and shook Lederer's hand. Beal said that he hoped to see Howard Lederer again, but not across a poker table. And with that, Andy Beal retired from high-stakes poker, or so it seemed at the time. Nevertheless, Beal left a crack open in the door. As he focused on what went wrong, regardless of whether he played again, his brain would continue trying to figure it out. He became convinced that many of his losses were not due to the pro's superior skill, but his failure to manage himself. Because Andy never slept well in Vegas, he would play long hours and tire himself out more easily. Consequently, Andy told the group that he would play one more game if they came to Dallas and played only 4 hours per day. Because Beal never received a response to his offer, he continued to declare that he was finished with poker. Poker, however, was not finished with Andy. With the game seemingly off, some members of the corporation began talking smack. Todd Brunson told the New York Daily News that he had beaten Andy for more than $20 million. The gloating left Beal incensed, particularly because, as he saw it, they were refusing to play him again. So he wrote an open letter to Doyle Brunson and his team, which he sent to Card Player magazine, challenging them to play him until one of them runs out of money. Doyle Brunson apologized for the fisherman tales about how much Beal had lost. Several of the players remain convinced that they will see Andy Beal across a poker table in Vegas, and that is just what happened in 2006. 1 year had passed since Andy Beal had gone heads up with the corporation, but Beal returned to Las Vegas and the Wynn Hotel Casino in 2006 to challenge poker professionals Jennifer Harman, Todd Brunson, David Gray, and Ted Forrest. This is a highlight of the 2-week span of events, with its twists and turns and highs and lows. This was an exhilarating ride and the final chapter of the richest high-stakes game in poker history. Wednesday, February 1, 2006. The high-limit area of the Wynn poker room was roped off only to Beal and members of the corporation. The stakes were negotiated and the corporation opted for $30,000, $60,000, but Beal insisted the limits be set at $25,50 with $50,000, $100,000 limits. The first player to play Beal, celebrating the biggest win during last year's union, was heads-up specialist Todd Brunson, and after 5 hours of intense counteraction, Andy Beal was up $1.6 million. Thursday, February 2nd. Jennifer Harman challenged Beal until the dinner break, winning $1 million. David Gray and Ted Forrest took their turns at the felt, losing the $1 million gain and essentially breaking even for the day. Friday, February 3rd. Ted Forrest was back and Beal employed a more aggressive style, but Forrest was unaffected by Beal's change in technique and ended the day with a $2.5 million surplus over the past 3 days. Saturday, February 4th. Ted Forrest returned, but Beal appeared focused and determined not to suffer a similar slide to the day before. Play ended at 7:30 p.m. with no substantial gains for either side. Sunday, February 5th. The short session with Todd Brunson broke around 4 p.m. and Beal was down $3 million for the week. That evening, Andy boarded a plane back to Dallas. It wasn't clear if he would return for another round of one-on-one matches, but none were prepared for the events that would transpire over the next few days. On Saturday, February 11th, Beal boarded a plane back to Las Vegas. The local press began reporting, and poker enthusiasts around the world were starved for updates. Soon, the national press had their own distant coverage and poker forums were alive with speculations, chatter, and gossip. Sunday, February 12th. Jennifer Harman returned to the felt with Doyle Brunson by her side. She accumulated almost $2 million at midday, but by session's end, she was down more than $5 million. Monday, February 13th. Todd Brunson had won $2.5 million for the corporation, but with an hour until break, Beal battled back for $1.2 million surplus in his favor. Tuesday, February 14th. Ted Forrest was able to regain $7 million of the previous losses, but with 2 hours remaining, Andy had profited $3.5 million. Wednesday, February 15th. Ted Forrest was short-stacked and unable to gain momentum. It wasn't long before the chip racks were empty. The corporation had depleted their $10 million bankroll and the game was over for now. They dusted themselves off and prepared for the LA Poker Classic to commence on Thursday in California. The corporation still holds a net gain over the course of several years, but Andy Beal came closer to evening the score and made a reputable comeback. Andy Beal returned to Dallas, Texas, but not before he praised his opponents for their grace and performance. The game was paused until the two teams could coordinate their schedules. Again, that could have and should have been the end of it. But the corporation demanded an opportunity to get their money back. So it happened that Andy Beal agreed to return on February 21st to 23rd to play. On Monday night, February 20th, 2006, Andy Beal was back on a plane to Las Vegas and checked himself into the Wynn Resort upon arrival. He returned to play a third week of high-stakes Texas Hold'em poker against a new challenger, the corporation's longtime team member, Phil Ivey. Phil Ivey was known for his aggressive play and unwavering focus at the tables. Tuesday, February 21. Play began late in the afternoon and blinds were set at 30 and 60,000. Ivey seemed to hold the lead throughout the day's match. Mostly Phil Ivey had exhibited an aggressive approach. In typical fashion, he sat blank face, focus, and with his mouth wide agape. Play ended at 7 p.m. and it appeared Ivey was up several racks. It was confirmed by a member of the corporation that the number was $2 million in Ivey and the corporation's favor. Wednesday, February 22nd. First thing Wednesday morning, Phil Ivey and Andy Beal were again heads up at the felt on table number 3. Blind remained at 30 and 60,000, and again, Ivey seemed to have the advantage over Beal. In less than 8 hours of heightened competition, Phil Ivey ended the day with another monetary gain of $4.6 million. Thursday, February 23rd. At 9 a.m., Andy Beal and Phil Ivey met for a third and final session. Phil Ivey sat in seat 2 and Beal sat in seat 6. The two players discussed the possibility of raising the stakes while the witnesses remained silent. It took only moments for Ivey and Beal to come to an agreement, increasing the limits to 50,000, 100,000. At around noon, the players took a short break. Beal was up by almost $2 million. From the rail, one could see Beal reaching repeatedly into his rack for chips. Within a few hands, it appeared Ivey had reversed his deficit and was back to even. Members of the corporation began to arrive and could be seen on the sidelines talking discreetly among themselves. They were careful to keep a respectful distance from the table so as not to distract the players. It was just after 1 p.m. when both players suddenly rose to shake hands. After approximately 4 hours of play, Phil Ivey had recovered his initial loss and won an additional $10 million. The corporation had recovered their $10 million loss since February 1st and earned another $6.6 million in revenue through Ivey's efforts. Andy Beal complimented members of the corporation for their sportsmanship and announced he would be heading back to Texas. The $16 million loss prompted Andy Beal to discontinue his challenge against the pro. On a side note, Phil Ivey took $75,000 off of Beal betting on coin flips. Recuperating and usurping the company's previous losses to Andy Beal, Phil Ivey truly showed Andy Beal where his place was in poker. Following this sequence of events, Andy Beal vowed he'd never play poker again, or at least not to Phil Ivey. This match seals Phil Ivey's reputation as one of the best and greatest poker players of all time. According to reports in 2011, Beal took part in some underground poker games, including actor Tobey Maguire and billionaire Alec Goris. Some reports claim that Andy Beal lost over $50 million in the course of 3 days, while others claim that the losses may be inflated. If those reports are true, then Andy Beal was approaching losses of $100 million lifetime in poker. While that pales in comparison to his overall wealth, it's more money than most pros will ever hope to make in their career. Andy Beal still plays the game today, but on a recreational basis. Of course, should he ever decide to give the corporation another crack at his money, a chair will always